All right, y'all. What's up, man? Welcome to the podcast with Soul. Myself, Sean Xavier Gumby Senior, the podcast with Soul, Stigmatism in My Soul, and Gumby Publishing. We don't wish to slander, defame, or libel anybody as it relates to this case that we're going to talk about today. United States of America versus Dion Gatlin. This is the Franks hearing, dated January 9th, 2017. The transcript of the Franks hearing. This is a 192-page document, and we're going to be discussing today. Keith Cromer is on the stand being cross-examined by attorney Humphrey, one of the defense attorneys. And what Humphrey is still trying to do is substantiate why CS1 or Tammy Cowins was receiving $2,500 a month as a stipend for information she was providing. Cromer, they ask him, Humphrey, the attorney, asks him about TFO Aguilar, David Aguilar, who is one of the DEA agents, one of the task force officers that was a subordinate to Keith Cromer. He reported to Keith Cromer. David Aguilar eventually got fired, terminated as a result of this case. After this all went down with the feds, he went back to Norcross Police Department in Norcross, Georgia, and did a Garrity hearing, which is like a closed door investigation, internal investigation amongst police officers. David Aguilar pled the fifth in this Franks hearing. He was subpoenaed to come and testify. He took the Fifth Amendment. He eventually got fired by the Norcross Police Department. So, what Tammy Cowins tries to do at this point, this is around 2013, late 2012, early 2013, and St. Louis is getting ready to run down on Cuffy and his crew. Tammy Cowins, Keith Cromer is telling Tammy Cowins at this point, stay away from Cuff. Don't, if he calls, take his calls, but don't get in any kind of activity with him as far as drugs, trying to make new connections for him. Stay out of that. This is what Keith Cromer is telling Tammy Cowins, because Keith Cromer knows that DEA St. Louis is getting ready to run down on Cuff. Tammy Cowins does not know this. CS2, Keith Cromer tells Tammy Cowins that if Cuffy calls her, Tammy Cowins, and asks her, yo, what's up with CS2? Is CS2 money? Is she straight? Is she 5-0? You ought to tell Cuffy she's good. She's not the police. Vouch for her. Now, Tammy Cowins, in the meantime, is trying to get Keith Cromer to do a third-party cooperation with some Spanish dudes out of Miami. There's this family down in Miami who have an import and export business, and their son or one of their family members is either on probation in Miami in the Southern District of Florida, or is in the feds in the Southern District of Florida. And Tammy Cowins is trying to bring them into the fold to connect Cuffy with them, right? To do a third-party cooperation to get their son either off probation or out of prison. Keith Cromer's not going for it. He shoots it down. He tells Tammy Cowins, in the Northern District of Georgia, we don't do third-party cooperation. And she explained the whole situation to him, and he was like, yo, this is too convoluted. I don't want nothing to do with this. Leave that shit alone. We don't do third-party cooperation in the Northern District of Georgia. That was his policy. He was group supervisor. And according to him, the U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Georgia at that time, they were not excited about doing third-party cooperations. It was a policy that they had amongst themselves. Obviously, a federal case, you could do third-party cooperation anywhere in the United States, but they chose not to do that, and that's what he said. We're gonna go over that. We also found out at this time that Blue Davinci, Barima McKnight, aka Blue Davinci, is still in touch with Tammy Cowins around this time. This is around July the 13th. And Blue Davinci actually tells Tammy Cowins that the 5-0, the feds have been watching Cuff. All of that's in here. Now, when in February 2013, DEA St. Louis, they arrest some of Cuffy's crew, and somebody's life gets taken. Terrence Morgan, his life gets taken as a result. He's suspected of being a informant. His life gets taken. Tammy Cowins relocates. She moves from her current residence. She moves somewhere else. She gets $5,000 to help her move, and I think another $6,000 to help her move. And this is in May of 2014. Now, it's alleged that the reason she moved was to move closer to Keith Cromer because they were carrying on this affair. But Keith Cromer denies that. He says, I had nothing to do with the $5,000 she got for her relocation. I had nothing to do with the other $6,000 that went on with her relocation, because I wasn't even supervising the group at that time. And Keith Cromer states the reason she relocated, the reason she moved, is because Cuffy and Blue Davinci knew where she lived. So that's why she moved. And this is when, DEA St. Louis is getting ready to run down on Cuff. They pretty much got everything they needed, and they knock off a few of his people. I don't know if he's with them at this point, but that's what's going down. So let's get into it. So I'm on page 77 of 192. So Humphrey asks Keith Cromer about a man by the name of Anthony Bambino. And so this references that Tammy Cowins has information that Cuff is trying to get in contact with an individual by the name of Anthony Bambino in reference to drugs. Keith Cromer, I think there's another name for P37, and it's the name of this family out of Florida. That's what I think it is. And yes, they give me the family's name. It's on the top of page 78 of 192, but I don't want to mention the family's name. And yes, they provided that information to all of us. And this is why. There is nothing wrong here because I tell you, they are on federal probation in the Southern District of Florida. And they tried to get them on board. Tammy Cowins tried to get them on board because they had an import-export business down there. And that family tried to, somehow Tammy Cowins knows them and tried to get them on board. And the story was so convoluted, I told them, don't worry about it. We're not doing third-party cooperation in the Northern District of Georgia. We don't do third-party cooperation because they had someone in jail. The second part, so you can understand, during this time right here, in February 2013, we explicitly expressed to Tammy Cowins, don't get involved in trying to conduct any drug transaction business with Cuffy. Because at that time, she didn't understand what was going on. She didn't know. And there's some other avenues, so you don't know what went on. But this right here, as far as this, it did happen. Yes, she explained that the task force officer, David Aguilar, because you know why I know it happened? Because they were on the phone with the probation office in the Southern District of Florida at the time. And then they came in to me. I said, it's too convoluted. Just leave it alone because we don't do third-party cooperation in the Northern District of Georgia. And if you look at the date, it's February 11, 2013. So that's what they're talking about. They were trying, this family down in Miami was trying to get one of their kids out of prison, federal prison. He was in there on drug trafficking charges, and Tammy wanted to get them on board with Cuff and get some kind of third-party cooperation. But Keith Cromer shoots it down. He shoots it right down. Tammy Cowins tried to get Cuffy involved, and this was something that could not happen because I wasn't going to do anything that was going to mess up the DEA St. Louis investigation. And since Tammy Cowins doesn't know what's going on with the investigation on Cuffy by DEA St. Louis, we had to be a filter or a stopgap. There was another instance I got called by DEA St. Louis in reference to another incident where Tammy Cowins tried to put herself back into the fold with Cuffy related to what's going on with the activities that he was doing. And they contacted me, and I shut Tammy Cowins down from making any inquiries about Cuffy with CS2. So Tammy Cowins is steady trying to get Cuffy jammed up so she could do some kind of third-party cooperation. But Keith Cromer is constantly having to tell her, no, chill. He doesn't tell her, but Keith Cromer knows DEA St. Louis is getting ready to run down on Cuffy. So he wants to keep her as far away and out of the way of the situation as possible. But Tammy Cowins is constantly bringing, third-party cooperation opportunities to Keith Cromer, and he doesn't bite. Now, Humphrey shows Keith Cromer this DEA 6. Let me read this to you. This is page 82 of 192. A DEA 6 and a DEA 103 are documents and forms that need to be signed in order to substantiate cash payments to federal informants. And this is the DEA 6 that is attached to this form. And when we're referencing Cuffy, once again, we're talking about Cuffy or Dion Gatlin, and P22, we're discussing Barima McKnight or Blue Davinci, and P62 is in reference to Terrence Morgan. Keith Cromer, I don't know who Terrence Morgan is. Okay, this is Humphrey, the lawyer. So it basically is a DEA 6 that says that Tammy Cowins hasn't spoken to Cuffy in 3 months, and that Tammy Cowins hasn't spoken with Blue Davinci, Barima McKnight, in 1 month, and that Barima McKnight informed Tammy Cowins that Cuff was being watched by the police since April of 2013, and they've arrested several people associated with Cuff. And that basically since the arrest, Terrence Morgan has lost his life. Now, for this particular DEA 6, Tammy Cowins only gets paid $2,000. And David Aguilar, who his whole function is just to make sure that the informants are paid and to do like administrative work. Now, Humphrey asks Keith Cromer, is the DEA 6 that he signed off on sufficient to give Tammy Cowins $2,000? Attorney Humphrey: if Task Force Officer Aguilar said that this is not sufficient information to substantiate a payment to Tammy Cowins of $2,000, do you disagree with that statement, sir? Keith Cromer: yes, I do. And you want to know why? TFO Aguilar is one of 14 people who work for me. TFO Aguilar doesn't have all of the knowledge of what's going on. Task Force Officer Aguilar wasn't in communication with DEA St. Louis, okay? Task Force Officer Aguilar's job was to maintain and do the payments and assist with the investigation. The people who know what Tammy Cowins is doing, they know. There is nothing inaccurate. This information here is in this report. This information here in this report is accurate. I hope you're not suggesting there's something inaccurate in it, because it's correct. I'm asking. The whole thing is sometimes in an interview, they're only telling you what they know. I mean, that's what an interview is for. This is Keith Cromer. What that person knows. See, you can't have it both ways, sir. You can't have it, if they don't know anything, they'll tell you they don't know anything. She said, I have spoken to certain people in this time. Whatever information they have is in there as well. But at the time this report is generated, this report is very important, okay? Because look at line 7. In that report where it says, Cuff and Blue Davinci know where Tammy Cowins lives, and therefore Tammy Cowins relocated. And what it is, I never told Tammy Cowins about the undercover meeting that St. Louis coordinated that we assisted them with. Tammy Cowins didn't know anything about the undercover operation. We never told them about that. The only thing we told while that enforcement thing with DEA St. Louis was going on is that if Cuffy calls you, you vouch for the validity of CS2. Tammy Cowins didn't know what was going on. But at some point, what's important here is that she knew somebody got their life lost over this, number one. But more importantly, sir, and it goes back to Tammy Cowins. In here it tells you why Tammy Cowins moved. Tammy Cowins moved because of the enforcement activity that occurred that DEA St. Louis did. CS2, as you and your associates asked me earlier, did the Tammy Cowins move to move closer to me? And the answer is unequivocally no. She tells you in this report why she moved. Because of the enforcement activity. That's why. Keith Cromer. Tammy Cowins relocated after evaluating the situation at hand, which was the dudes getting arrested in St. Louis. And forced by activity that happened, the main target who St. Louis was after, who she was cooperating on, which is Cuffy, one of his associates got arrested from that undercover operation. Tammy Cowins didn't know it was an undercover operation. I knew what it was, and that's the reason she moved, was because of that enforcement activity that was done by DEA St. Louis. So, that's what happened, straight from the paperwork. And I'm gonna be doing another video later today. See y'all later.